Welcome. It's a pleasure to chat with you today, Dawson, about your work, which is obviously extremely fascinating. And why don't we go right to a major theme of your work, which is the emotional freedom technique, or EFT, which is tapping. And there's a great deal of curiosity about this procedure anyway. So perhaps you could fill in what exactly EFT is.
Sure, I'd be happy to. And I have been involved with over 100 clinical trials of EFT. And so research shows that it's effective for anxiety, depression, phobias, and many other forms of stress. And EFT is the addition of a really interesting ancient technique that comes from the acupuncture world to modern psychological techniques like exposure and also seeing the world in a certain way. So EFT combines techniques from exposure therapy, from cognitive therapy, but to those it adds the ingredient of acupressure, and acupressure is simply pressure on acupuncture points. And Qigong was doing this thousands of years ago. We know that acupuncture points were known in Europe as long ago as 6,000 years ago. And so they've been around for a long, long time. And what we now can measure using scientific instruments is that when you apply pressure or use needles on acupuncture points, all kinds of energy flows change in your body and your brain. Like, for example, if you have a fearful thought or a fearful memory, the part of your brain that processes fear, your limbic system in the center of your brain, gets highly active. So you're thinking about a interpersonal conflict you had last week, or you're thinking about a deadline you have next week, or you think about a traumatic event in your life, and that emotional part of your brain that's processing that fear or that anger or that resentment or that stress becomes highly active. And we see this on EEGs with that part of the brain becoming all lit up. Once we have people in that state then apply pressure to acupuncture points, we find that part of the brain rapidly calms down. They're still thinking about the troubling event, but now the emotional brain is dormant. And so applying pressure to these points, usually by tapping on them or rubbing them or applying light pressure to them, while you're thinking about things that bother you, sends two signals to the brain. The memory sends a signal to go into fight or flight. The acupressure sends the signal of calm, and the brain then realizes that that memory, even though it may be a really traumatic memory, is no longer a threat to your survival, and the emotional brain calms down. So now using EFT with veterans, we've used it with victims of school shootings in the US, we've used it with Holocaust survivors in Rwanda, we've used it with people from after Hurricane Katrina and other natural disasters, and it's really remarkable to see people who are processing, again, these often terrible, tragic memories really quickly calm down just by tapping on acupuncture points while they think of the memories.
Excellent. Thank you. Are there any, you keep tapping the side of your hand. Is that a particularly important point?
Yes, and there are energy flows in our bodies which we measure using different kinds of instrumentation. And that side of hand point is a way, the one we usually start off with EFT. So there's one over here, and there are other meridians on your body as well. We begin with this one over here because we found that if you start here, it usually, if you have any kind of resistance to change, it's helpful to stimulate that point first. And so sometimes our issues are really simple. We can solve them very quickly. Maybe, for example, you had an annoyance. A few days ago, we had to wait in line for a long time, and then somebody cut in line in front of you. So that's a fairly minor annoyance. But there are people who have long-term issues, like, for example, they're sabotaging their relationships over and over and over again. And weight loss. I think there are 12 studies right now on EFT and weight loss. And so people that crave salty foods, fatty foods, sweets and cake and all these things that people tend to crave, when they tap, that again shifts the brain's function, and they calm down. But they also tend to have a recurrence when they're faced with those craved foods again. And this point over here is really effective at getting them very quickly into a receptive state and letting go of any subconscious blocks and resistance to making progress.
So from the way you've described it, this tapping is something people can and do themselves. Is it ever done by someone on someone else?
It's done yourself, usually, even with a therapist or coach. So if you're in a room, say with a therapist or coach, or on a Zoom call with a coach or a therapist, typically you'll be tapping on yourself, they'll be tapping on themselves, and they'll be tapping along with you, even if you're in person. And then we recommend people use EFT for all the ups and downs of life, Richard. So every day in life, no matter how spiritually evolved you are, there are going to be annoyances that tend to make you stressed. And it's interesting when we study, say, monks who've been meditating for 25 years, or Franciscan nuns who've spent their lives in the convent, even after decades, they still have those minor annoyances. So we recommend people use EFT on those things that stress you. What we don't recommend you use EFT on yourself is PTSD or really deep trauma, especially complex PTSD, childhood PTSD, early life PTSD. And we recommend that if you have any issue like that, you go and work with a therapist trained in EFT, because you don't want to risk, there's this phenomenon that researchers named in the 1970s called re-traumatization. And that happens, like, for example, there was a psychiatrist after World War II called Joseph Walpe, who was working with World War II veterans. And he was a good Freudian, an expert psychiatrist. And so he got the veterans into his office and would say, okay, now lay down on the couch and tell me about Omaha Beach. And he later wrote about that experience as a Freudian. He said, that type of therapy was not useless. It was harmful. And what he was noticing was what we now call re-traumatization. If you are thinking about a traumatic event without a release, without emotional catharsis, then you actually can recall the event vividly, light up all those neural pathways in your brain, and re-traumatize yourself. So we're very cautious about this with people with PTSD, and we recommend that they work with a therapist. So yeah, use yourself for minor things. For long-standing issues, go work with an expert. For childhood trauma, certainly work with a trained therapist.
Maybe you could explain one thing that seems to happen with traumatic memories is their frequent and involuntary recurrence.
Yes.
Why do the most horrible things that happen to you keep coming back to your mind?
I know, Richard. It's one of the things that really bedevils meditators. They close their eyes and try and meditate. I know when I was 15 years old and going to live in a spiritual community and being trained to meditate, and they said, close your eyes and still your mind. And you close your eyes and you can't still your mind. Your mind immediately gravitates to negative thinking. And so we now learn, when we discovered this part of the brain in the late 1990s, a researcher called Marcus Rakel identified this group of regions right in the front of your brain here and right in the back of your brain here, which we now call the default mode network. And the default mode network is the network to which our brains default when we aren't doing a task. So when we're doing things, when I'm writing a blog post, when I'm working on a spreadsheet, when I'm focused on writing a research paper, when I'm working with a client, then another set of brain regions is active called the task positive network. I'm doing stuff. And so the task positive network is on. It's in a different part of the brain. It's the lateral brain regions that are active. But when I go take a break, when I go have a cup of tea, when I take a walk, immediately my default mode network kicks in, because that's the network the brain defaults to when I'm not doing a task. And that network is one that processes regret, fear, reminiscence about bad things, just regurgitating the negative over and over and over again. In the 1950s, psychologists noted what they called the brain's negativity bias. And later on, neuroscience discovered what brain regions are responsible for that, and it's the default mode network. And so what researchers have found is that about a half of our thoughts are negative and repetitive. We just go back to defaulting to that over and over and over again. And when you think about why would our brains default like that? I used to joke that if I were God, I would have made us so that our brains default to happiness. I wish my brain would default to happiness, and the darn thing won't cooperate. I go for a walk, and even me, I have a wonderful life, and I'll go for a walk and I'll worry about the one bad thing that happened that day, not the 59 things that went well. And so that's just the way our brains are hardwired. But that's because we're all secure now. None of us are worrying about a roof over our heads or getting clean water and edible food. But go back 100,000 years, go back even 1,000 years, and our ancestors had to think about that obsessively. So the brain evolved to obsessively focus on the tiger that almost ate me yesterday and the tiger that might eat me tomorrow. And that was a highly adaptive activity for the brain to default to figuring out how to escape the tiger of yesterday and tomorrow. And you'll notice in those two tenses, tomorrow, the future, yesterday, the past, the default mode network is not in the present. And so our job as meditators and on a spiritual journey is to learn to release the stresses of the past and worries about the future and come into the present moment. But that's the way the brain just works naturally. It has a negativity bias. We think about those things. And so we need techniques. And there are lots of good ones. I mean, EFT is the most effective, efficient one I've found. But there are things like time and nature will do it, certain kinds of immersive music and contemplative experiences will do it. Grounding will do it. Often a movement, like I love Qigong, yoga, things like that will do it. So anything you can do to deactivate that default mode network is going to put you in a happier state. But that's unfortunately just the hardware you were born with, the hardware you have in your brain. And so our practice, our spiritual practices and our self-growth practices are to really dial down that part of the brain. That's really what we see with these monks and nuns. In just a few moments, when they start meditation or contemplation or prayer, you see an immediate dialing down of activity in the default mode network, and suddenly they're escaping all their local worries, and they're able to have this upliftment in consciousness and then move into those higher states of awareness.
Well, that's fascinating. Thank you. One thing that you mentioned in your book, Bliss Brain, which I have here, is the importance of attention and the importance of developing attention. Could you go into a little bit about that for us, please?
Well, attention is this very interesting currency, and it's a currency of which the richest person in the world has the same amount as the poorest person in the world. We all have 24 hours, 7 days a week. And so what are we paying attention to? And I had the good fortune in my previous career. So before I got into personal growth, before I got into research and training, I was in book publishing. And so as a book publisher in the 1980s and 1990s, I got to know a lot of the leaders, spiritual leaders in the personal growth movement. And so what I found was that they are all just dealing with their personal growth challenges as well. And we all are, and we all have to find our way into new states. But they were often, as I worked in publishing, they were often wrestling with their own issues too. And so what I noticed that they would do, though, is they would shift their attention, and they were good at shifting their attention, and they would be able to shift their attention away from the distractions around them and then focus on something that was a much more deliberate, defined, conscious goal. I worked with a scientist called Bruce Lipton, for example, on his book called The Biology of Belief. And I worked with him on that book for a while, a couple of years. And I was just interested to watch Bruce. And he just would detach his attention from the outside stimuli, and he'd tune into something infinite and higher than himself. So I watched people like Marianne Williamson do that, and people like Jack Canfield do that, and Joe Dispenza. I spent a lot of time with Joe Dispenza in various events he did, and I did studies of his work. And again, Joe is really attuned to those higher states of consciousness and is able to detach his attention from the minutiae of the everyday world. And so what many people do is they are not giving themselves time to plug in to something greater than themselves. They aren't giving themselves the space in their lives to pay attention to the all that is. They are focused very much on their, what I call in my books, your local life. And local life is fine to be focused on. You want to make sure you're eating well, and that you're solvent, and that you're working effectively at the local level. But if that's all you know and all you're immersed in, and you're missing non-local, then you're missing out on what you really are, because we know from the words of the masters that we are that non-local consciousness, and that we are that localized in a body and a mind and a heart. So we have this local facility here. If all of our attention is directed at local, at my money, my life, my kids, my parents, my job, my body, if we're totally enmeshed in our local lives, if all our attention goes there, we never detach our attention and plug it in to non-local, then we miss out on who we really are. So that power of our attention is so crucial to this, and it is 100% a choice. You wake up in the morning, what do you do? I watch people sometimes when I'm teaching a live workshop, like when I'm at a teaching institute and I'm there with people, they'll wake up and then they'll look at their phone immediately, and they'll look at social media, and they'll look at the news. And so right away, they've just woken up and they're directing their attention to the outer local world. And what I strongly recommend people do is, instead, when you wake up in the morning, first, make it your top priority and plug your attention in to the non-local world. Just meditate, breathe, be in your body, be present, enter that present moment, and then enter that space of connection, of communion with the all it is. Then you're in touch with non-local reality, and that's what we find, and the mystics tell us this, we find peace and joy, compassion, gratitude, awe, a sense of awe that life is how it is, and we are who we are, and we get to live these bodies. And so you direct your attention there as you wake up in the morning, and then you plug in, and then suddenly, Richard, you're now in your local life later in the day, but with all the resources, all the wisdom, all of the knowledge, all the inspiration that comes from directing your attention to the infinite. So that's where we come from. That's where we can choose to direct our attention to every day. And a life lived consciously plugging your attention in to what is greater than yourself, that non-local consciousness, results in a local life that is completely and radically different and infinitely better.
Well, you do speak of the local and the non-local selves, but you also talk about being in the body, being in the present moment, and that would would seem to be the ultimate local self, you and your body right here, rather than either non-local or the news that's kind of flattering in our heads. So how do you explain that?
Yeah, so the mystery we get to live is being both. And it's a profound experience to live as both. And so we have this local reality that we find ourselves in. I have a body, I have a mind, I have emotions, I have this local world, I have a family, I have a team, I have a nonprofit organization I run. So we have all of this local activity we do. And it's wonderful to do that, because I get to influence people. One of the things I'm happiest about having done over the last decade is we've delivered free EFT treatment to over 20,000 veterans suffering from PTSD. And our research shows we have over 6 randomized controlled trials showing that EFT is incredibly valuable and actually eliminates PTSD symptoms like flashbacks and nightmares and intrusive thoughts from those veterans' lives. So having done it with 20,000 people, I'm really grateful I did that. And that's a local activity. So I like being in the body. I like writing books. I like giving talks. I like sharing in that way. And then we are also far more than that. And when we detach from our local reality, we go and we find inspiration in non-local. And so I know when I'm writing, for example, when I wrote my previous book, Mind to Matter, I would usually I'd wake up in the morning around 4 a.m. to write on my writing days. And then I'd meditate for about 2 hours. Then I'd start to write. And then I'd write for usually about 6 hours. And then at that point, it was the afternoon. I would then shower, brush my teeth and have breakfast. So I have this pattern of tuning into non-local. And as I would tune into non-local, we find from giant meta-analyses of meditation research that when you're plugged into that non-local reality, that you have more synchronicity in your life, you have more clairvoyance, more clairaudience, more psychokinesis, all these seemingly altered states and altered realities. You have more of them than when you aren't plugged in there. And one of the really amazing pieces of research I talk about both in my earlier book, Mind to Matter, and my new book, Bliss Brain, is the research showing what happens in terms of your oneness with cosmic cycles. And what the researchers who do this measure is sunspots. So there are things happening in the universe, things happening in the solar system that cause solar flares. Sometimes the sun's very quiet. Sometimes there are big flares. Sometimes there are very strong flares. Sometimes there are a series of flares. And so astronomers measure these flares and chart them. And we have records of solar flares going back to the 1700s. And so that's these cosmic cycles. They also produce interferences in the Earth's electromagnetic field. So as the solar wind rushes by the Earth, it distorts the Earth's electromagnetic field, and those distortions are measurable. And again, there's a lot of really complicated math and science behind this, which I won't go into now. Other than that, they measure the fluctuations in these geomagnetic patterns. So in the series of studies starting about 10 years ago, researchers hooked meditators and people who were really good at holding a sense of inner peace up to heart rate variability monitors. And they did long-term studies for 30 days, measuring the heart rate variability of someone in that deeply peaceful state. And they found and replicated this now, that the heart rate variability of an individual in that state, when laid against the rhythm of solar flares for that same 30-day period, looks almost identical. In other words, we are literally attuned on the level of our individual local bodies to the cosmos and these non-local levels. And that's the way to live in sync with those, because when you're in sync with those, you're in sync with everyone else who is also in sync with them. So that's why, again, more synchronicity, more of these seemingly anomalous abilities in people who are doing that, because they're in tune with larger cycles. And that's where you want to start your day, by directing your attention up there, plugging into non-local, and then just finding inspiration. Like when I was writing, even when I was writing Mind to Matter, I would need a piece of information, and then some scientist I didn't even know, who was maybe a friend of a friend, would email me the one study in 1,000 I needed to complete that chapter, or I needed to know about some obscure part of science. And I'd find myself sitting on a science panel at a conference, and the world's top expert in that little arcane bit of research was seated next to me, and I'd have a chance to talk to her. So in all kinds of ways, my life just unfolds synchronistically as well. And when you are in tune that way, local to non-local, it's just a wonderful way to live.
Well, what you said about sunspots is fascinating. And is there any correlation between sunspot activity and major events on Earth, whether it's cataclysms, earthquakes, climate change, war? Has any correlation of that sort been noted?
Yes, it has. And that's actually what gave the researchers who did that study, or that series of studies, the idea. So this Russian scientist, and if I tell you his name, Richard, I'll probably mangle it, Cherkevsky, in the early 1900s, was looking at sunspots. Again, we have records going back 300 years. And he was looking at wars and revolutions and giant social movements. And he found the same sort of relationship, that they waxed and waned with sunspot activity. When the sun was quiet, there wasn't much of that happening. Whenever there were big sunspots, big solar flares, either there were wars, or there were major battles within wars, or major social movements like the French Revolution.
Oh, fascinating. Well, let's go to another mass phenomenon. And one thing that strikes me is there's an enormous amount of work done on brain science, cognitive science, work like your own, and a lot of amazing discoveries, which are very impressive. On the other hand, we have a situation of that's basically a mental illness pandemic in the United States. Mental health, quite possibly, has never been worse in history. There's all of this psychology, all of these therapists running around doing good or not, I don't know. And yet, tens of millions of people are falling apart. How do you account for that?
Yeah, and mental health is a crisis. According to the World Health Organization, the rates of depression and anxiety have almost doubled since the start of the pandemic, and referrals to psychiatrists have also almost doubled in the last few years. So, objectively speaking, as we measure this globally, there is much more anxiety and depression, almost twice as much as there was, say, in 2019. And in 2019, I mean, there was also we were already at high levels of anxiety and depression, and now there's even more. And I think it's just the multiple events, shocks to the system that have happened in the last few years. The pandemic obviously was a global phenomenon. And then other global phenomena like challenges to democracy, challenges to established orders, the pace of change. You think about our ancestors. I mean, if you looked at a peasant in England around, say, just say 1810, like around 1810, 1820, looked at the average peasant in France or Germany or China or India, the average person, not the kings and queens, but the nobility, but the average person. Then you zoom back 1,000 years, a millennium, and looked at the life of the average peasant back then, 1,000 years before. They didn't change very much between those two periods. Go back even 1,000 years before that, and they were living in very much the same way. So life was very, very similar, and we had to deal with change. I mean, there were wars, and there were various social upheavals, and the world wasn't totally stable, but the pace of change was nowhere near what it is now. Now, the world is changing astonishingly fast, and so we are now challenged to keep up with it and to deal with it, because we have to change and we have to adapt much faster than our ancestors could or ever had to. And how do we do that? And that's again why I am such an advocate of that hour every morning, or that even half hour where you tune into Non-Local, because guess what? That's always there. It's always full of love. It's always full of joy. It's always overflowing with gratitude. It's always overflowing with wisdom. And so in those great non-local information fields of, I borrowed the term non-local consciousness. There are lots of other ways to characterize it. Teilhard de Chardin in the 1950s called it the noosphere, or the psychosphere of consciousness around the planet. There are lots of ways of naming it, the all that is, the Tao, but that is unchanging. That is the ground of being. That is the fundamental place of consciousness. That is the stuff of the universe, the consciousness that runs the universe, and that doesn't change. And so, personally, I find that there's change, there's upheaval, things are unreliable. Like, I had a huge shift. In fact, it's coming on the 5-year anniversary now of a shattering experience in my life, which is a wildfire. And in my book, Bliss Brain, I tell the story in the first chapter how I was awoken one night by my wife. She was shaking me on my shoulder and saying, "Dawson, something's terribly wrong." And I looked at the clock and said 12:45 a.m. I looked out the window. There was a glow on the horizon. I walked outside, and there was a wildfire rushing down the adjoining hill toward our home. And I just yelled at her, "We're getting out of here right now." We just threw on our clothes, grabbed our car keys, and sprinted out. And as we drove out, the trees above our head were just bursting into flame. It was just a crazy night. When we finally were about 3 miles away and we were safe, we turned and watched the fire, which had slowed down by then. And there was so much noise because gas tanks were exploding, propane tanks were exploding, cars were exploding, houses were exploding. It sounded like being in the middle of a war with all of these combustibles being consumed by the flames. And so we lost our home, we lost our office, we lost our storage facility. We lost literally everything in a few moments that night. And so we had to spend a few years recovering from that. We also lost our income, our business collapsed as our office burned down, and we had all kinds of adverse experiences in the succeeding couple of years. But in one of the blogs I wrote for the Huffington Post around that time, I took a number of photographs from the fire, and some of them were pretty depressing, like showing just the concrete slab of our house and a pile of ashes on top and the chimney sticking out. The stone chimney was still standing. It even melted our cars, melted everything. But there was one thing in the office that did not get melted, and that was a Buddha, ceramic Buddha. And somebody had stuffed this Buddha in the back of a storage closet many years before. Then we piled papers on top of it. Eventually, we forgot all about the Buddha in the back of the storage closet until the office burned down and there was no more closet, no more paper. And then this photograph is just so amazing to me. It shows the Buddha sitting there, serene, and there's all the ash around the Buddha. And so I wrote in the Huffington Post about how compassion doesn't burn and love doesn't burn. And that's what I want people to know, is that your life can burn down around you. And all of those values that are there in non-local, they're still there. There's no less love there when you lose your house and your money and your retirement savings and your health and the things you treasure the most in the world. You still have exactly the same amount of love, same amount of compassion, same amount of joy potentially. And actually, after the fire, the subsequent year is when I wrote my new book, Bliss Brain, because I realized that I was able to connect every morning with that non-local space and find all the resources there that I needed, regardless of what was happening in the local scene. So that's the antidote here, is that what makes you serene isn't the things outside of you. What makes you serene is the things inside of you that you have contact with. Even when your house and your office and your life burns down, you then still are tuned into something greater than yourself, and you are a resilient human being. So that's the message I think we as a collective humankind are moving toward. I think we will discover, many of us are discovering our inner resources. It's interesting, even despite this this increase in mental health disorders like anxiety and depression, I believe that we are in the middle of a new renaissance of consciousness. And I believe human consciousness is really moving in an upward direction. And you might look at police brutality and the wars and the disintegration of democracy and all of the social strife. And you might say, Dawson, you're crazy. I'm reading the news. How can you say we're in the middle of a leap to a new level of consciousness? But if you look at the data, it's really interesting. Look at the last 50 years of data, and in the back of Bliss Brain, the last chapter, I summarize that, all kinds of key studies showing that many metrics show that human beings are actually becoming much better off and their consciousness is changing. So yeah, there are all of these. If you're sucked into local reality, you're going to panic and be depressed. If you're deliberately directing your attention to non-local reality, you will live a life of absolute inspiration. And I know so many people now who are breaking through into that level of joy, and they're living in Bliss Brain. And so we're at a bifurcation point in society. We're either getting sucked into local and into despair, or you are just moving into oneness with the all that is. You know that is who you really are, and then that becomes your dominant reality. And one metric that shows that shift is, I have a chapter in Bliss Brain called the 1%. And I became very interested in the fact that 1% of people in the world meditated when I learned to meditate. So when I was meditating in the 1970s and 80s, 1% of the people in the world meditated. The other 99% of the world did not. So we have that piece of data. Then I thought, well, how many people in the world were meditating, say, 100 years ago, 1,000 years ago? Can I find out how many people were on a spiritual path of some kind? And Richard, the amazing thing I find in that chapter called the 1% in my book, Bliss Brain, is that you go back to a census in England in 1100 AD, and it shows that of the people in England back then, almost 1,000 years ago, 1% were involved in spiritual pursuits. There's data from France, 1%. Medieval Germany, 1%. China in 1300, India in 1100, there's data showing that it was 1%. It's been 1% of people throughout history that have had any kind of notion of connecting to something greater than themselves until 1980. By 2004, in the US and in Western European countries, that number quadrupled to 4%. By 2016, in developed countries, it was 14%. And today, it's heading to 20%, a 20-fold increase in the number of people who are paying attention to that level of consciousness. So there are these two parallel things happening. One is people choosing to uplift their awareness, direct their attention up here, and enter that sacred space. And a lot of people who don't do that, getting absorbed in local chaos and finding a lot to be anxious and depressed about. So we're having this bifurcation in awareness. And that, I think, is the trend that we're seeing now.
Wow. Well, that's fascinating. That's certainly an amazing story about losing your house. And to bring it to a very practical level, of the various practices and techniques that you use, what were you doing the day after your house burned down? How were you coping with that trauma right afterward?
Wow.
It's not a joke question. I mean, because that's the time, obviously, this has to come to play. Well, do you remember what you did?
I do. So that night after the first day, we had been evacuated. We'd gone to some friend's house, but then they were evacuated because it was a moving fire, and they thought that it might move further. So our friends were then evacuated. So we rented a hotel room right on the coast, as far away as we can get from the fire, and drove out there. And then as night fell, it was a bizarre sight because the sun was setting through this haze of ash, and it was red, blood red sun going into the ocean. So it was chilling. We didn't have any good information. The whole reporting system, the news system, had totally broken down in our area. No one knew what was going on. And so we listened to newscasts, trying to figure out what was going on. And there was just either no information or misinformation. So we were very unsettled. And so we woke up that first morning after that, and I could feel that I was just profoundly off balance as a human being. And I woke my wife up and I said, darling, we have to do something right now. This is an emergency. We have to sit up now in bed immediately, and we must meditate. We need to meditate, right? This is an emergency meditation. So we did. We sat up in bed, and Richard, as we did that, began to meditate, I literally felt myself drop back into my body. Now, people who are traumatized are out of their bodies. They dissociate because it's not safe in your body. But when you start to integrate again, you drop into your body. And I felt literally as though it was like dropping this big, like bowling ball flat on the ground. And I just dropped back into my body that very first morning as I meditated. And then we thought about stuff we had lost. We had just received texted photographs from a friend who sent us the photographs from the house. She'd got into the area, taken some photographs, and then texted them to us, and just shown us those images of the whole area burned down, our house just a concrete slab with a chimney sticking up, all the ash there. And so we knew then we had nothing to go back to. And so part of it was just letting that sink in. And then the funny side of it began to occur to us. Like, for example, I had some boxes of photographs my mother had taken, like they did from the 1950s and 60s. And she died decades ago, but I had these boxes of mom's photographs, like 5 boxes in the garage, and it had been on my to-do list to sort through mom's photographs. But, years had gone by, 20 years had gone by and they're still there in the garage. I haven't done it. Every once in a while, the box would start to sag to the side under its own weight. These photographs are heavy. I'd push the box back up there and forget about it for another 3 years. So I turned to Christine, I laughed and I said, you know what? I can cross sorting mom's photograph off my to-do list. And then I emailed our manager because I knew the building had burned down that housed her office. I said, Heather, guess what? One of our business goals for the last 5 years, it's been on our business goal list, has been to move to a paperless office. And I'm pleased to report that there is not one single scrap of paper left in the office. So we began to just crack jokes about it. It was so funny. We realized that, and we were just realizing we had love, we had family, we had compassion, we had joy, we had all these things. Now, that doesn't mean that it was like kind of, cracking jokes as you walk by the graveyard. So there's an element of that to it, as gallows humor as well. And we did have periods of really mourning the loss. 22 people died. 8 of our neighbors died within 100 yards of our home because they got trapped in their garages when the power went out. And we mourned people, we mourned pets, we mourned things we could never replace. I had furniture from before the American Revolutionary War that burned up there. But, we knew where our priorities lay, and we knew we could plug into that non-local awareness anytime. And so we were able to move through it. So we were surprised. It took us a year, maybe 2 years. We got great treatment. I have so many therapist friends. I had a queue of people lining up to tap with me and meditate with me and do various forms of energy therapies with me. And I needed some. Like, there's one image, terrifying image I had in my mind, that when I'd been running to the car from the house to escape, I wondered if I was overreacting. I thought, maybe it's just going to pass, it won't be that bad. And suddenly a tree ignited and just exploded. And this tree had a candle-shaped flame that went up maybe 20 or 30 feet into the air. And I could not eradicate that memory from my memory banks. I just had emotional charge around that memory. It took an energy worker 2 hours of work with me to eradicate that one image. So I don't want to make light of this and say, you work with people and they're over it in a few days. They're not. It can take you a year or two. But again, you have all. So the chapter 7 of Bliss Brain is called post-traumatic growth, because research shows that 1/3 of people sink into depression, anxiety, and PTSD. 2/3 of people just use that tragedy as a springboard to move into higher levels of awareness. And so the research shows that actually the majority of people, those tragedies actually provide impetus, momentum for personal growth.
Wow, that's fascinating. Where exactly was this that this took place, the wildfire?
It's called the Tubbs Fire. And at that time, it was the worst wildfire in Northern California history. So Northern California. And then the next year, there was the Paradise Fire, where 89 people died. And that then became the worst fire in the area. So those two fires, Tubbs 2017 and Paradise 2018, were the two huge wildfires that killed a lot of people and destroyed a lot of property.
Yeah, that must have been dreadful. Anyway, I think that's been very helpful. I think a lot of people can use that information as they deal with their own trauma. So that's really quite fascinating. So in any case, how do you link all of this to conventional religious practice? Is there a connection, or are they two totally distinct fields?
Well, religions all came out of a spiritual experience. Moses went to the mountaintop, Mount Sinai, came back with the 10 Commandments, and birthed modern Judaism. And then Jesus had 40 days in the wilderness, had these elevated experiences, and then came back. And then the Christian religion developed. Muhammad had his night journey where he went into the 7 levels of paradise and had these, again, elevated experiences, and then came back and really defined Islam. And so wherever you go, you find that people have had these elevated mountaintop experiences, peak experiences. They then come back down, and then religions take shape. And the religions essentially are trying to direct people back to that experience. They do that in various ways. They tend to get bogged down in theology and dogma and the practices of that time. There's a lot of cultural baggage that comes along with them, and historical baggage. And so you get a whole bunch of stuff sticking to that. As they become popular, there are power-seeking bishops and priests and other religious officials, the state, that tries to like piggyback on them. So it's often hard to find the truth within religions. But the actual central experience that all of these mystics had is simply touching the all that is. They simply let go for a while of local reality and their local selves, and they ascended in consciousness and had this experience, and then came down and tried to share it with people in various ways. And so the religions look different, but the mystical experience is one. And so what you want to do is move yourself toward that mystical experience. And the interesting thing nowadays is that many people are having those experiences without religions. And so they often leave religions and find them outside of religions. And so that's why the largest demographic group now in the developed countries is called spiritual, but not religious. They aren't going to church. They aren't paying tithes. They aren't believing even in a God necessarily, but they're having these deeply spiritual experiences. In Bliss Brain, I look at the research among atheists, and we find that atheism does not inoculate you from mystical experiences. That we find that atheists and agnostics have as many of them as people who believe in God, who are religious. So this ability to let go of your local identity and merge with non-local is a universal human ability. And so we all have this and can do it, and we all do it. Not a single person on earth, I don't think, has no elevated experiences ever. If you just, like the other night, the sun was setting, beautiful sunset. So I just walked outside and stood there. My wife then saw it as well. She walked out there with me, bought us glasses of wine. We sipped wine and looked at the sunset. Had this elevated experience of oneness with nature and something greater than ourselves. We've all seen a sunset. We've all taken a walk by a stream. We all may have held a child, held a lover, held another human being, done a good deed for someone else. And so we all have these glimpses of moving into those elevated states for a little while. What the mystics do is they get good at it. And so they practice this. And so that default mode network that keeps us stuck in the past and the future and keeps us out of the present moment and keeps us focused on suffering, that part gets quiet. And then we have other brain circuits that kick on. And in Bliss Brain, I call those the enlightenment network. And there are 4 sub-circuits to it, which we won't go to now. But you can learn to deactivate the default mode network and light up the enlightenment network deliberately. So maybe it did that accidentally one day when you watched the sunset, when you were walking on the beach and your toes were squishing into the sand, and you were watching the shorebirds running along the waves. Maybe you had that moment then, and we've all had those elevated moments where we enter that same state of the mystic for a while. But if you practice it, and if you practice shutting down the default mode network and lighting up the enlightenment network over and over and over again in daily meditation, then you get better and better and better at that. And eventually you are, one of the miracles of what we can do, like this is something no other animal can do. Dogs, horses, monkeys, goats, elephants, none of them can do what we do, which is change the anatomical structure of our brains. Like no animal can do that. We're doing it all the time. Every single thought we think is either firing and wiring neural networks in the default mode network and the fear network, or it is wiring networks that make us happy and resilient. And just one example from Bliss Brain, just one little circuit we find very, very active in 2 kinds of people. So the prefrontal cortex over here, the executive part of the brain behind our temples here, has a lot of great functions. And one of them is it can direct us towards certain goals and concepts and types of thinking. And so we have our emotional midbrain in the center of our heads, the limbic system. Then we have our prefrontal cortex. Then we have a little thread, like a little bundle of wiring running from the prefrontal cortex into the limbic system, into the emotional brain. It's called the ventromedial prefrontal cortex. And what we find in these monks and nuns who've done a lot of contemplation is they have been firing that ventromedial prefrontal cortex over and over and over again for years, even decades, and it's big and it's strong. And so what happens is they have all the usual annoyances and irritations of life happen to them, but they are really good at controlling and dialing down and deactivating negative emotion. So they might have the usual, they may have things happen in the monastery or in the nunnery that annoy them, but they're really good at just regulating negative emotion, the limbic system, through the prefrontal cortex via the ventromedial prefrontal cortex, regulating the brain's limbic system, which handles emotion. So that's what happens. That's the wiring we're doing if we're doing meditation, if we're tapping, if we're doing personal growth, if we're entering non-local mind. We are wiring, and as we wire that ventromedial prefrontal cortex emotion control circuit, we're firing it, we're wiring it, it's becoming bigger and stronger. The other end of the spectrum is studies of people with major depressive disorder. And two things happen to their ventromedial prefrontal cortex. One is that it's not nearly as big or as thick as meditators. It's a little spindly, little amount of neurons. It doesn't have the capacity to control negative emotion. That's one half of the equation. The other half is that it starts to actually send signals in the wrong direction. And our emotionality begins to control our cognition. Now we're annoyed by the person who cuts in front of us in the line, and we get mad with them, we have the emotion, and then that's controlling our thinking process. So now the emotion is controlling the thinking you rather than the thinking you regulating the emotional you. And then we make up a reason why we feel anger or hatred or lust or resentment or guilt or blame or shame or another negative emotion. So this is literally a physical process. We are literally wiring our brains with every single thought and emotion we have. In Bliss Brain, I have an amazing set of images from an electron microscope, high resolution electron microscope, and it zooms in so tightly, it actually is showing two neurons, and they're firing together. And as they fire together, they start to grow together. And as you watch them, they get closer and closer and closer, and then they wire together. And the whole process of firing, wiring takes 12 seconds. So in 12 seconds, if I am sending that signal of love and kindness and compassion, I'm starting to wire neurons. If I'm sending the signal of resentment or blame or anger or any negative emotion, every 12 seconds, I'm wiring new neurons. And we literally start to change the anatomy of our brains. And when we look at some of the research in Bliss Brain, we see it starts to happen measurably within a month. If you are firing and wiring certain circuits within just 1 month, there are parts of your neural bundles in your brain that are going to increase measurably just because of your state of consciousness. So those mystical experiences, they're literally reshaping your brain, which no other animal is capable of doing. After 10, 20 years of that, you just are a resilient, loving human being. And your house burns down, you lose your money, you have a health crisis, you live through a recession, whatever you have to deal with on the outside world, and you just have all of this neural circuitry of resilience. So paying attention over time results in rewiring and a completely different brain.
Well, that's fascinating. It's very helpful. Well, I think we've come to the end of our time. You certainly provided us with a huge amount to think about, and a great deal of it is very encouraging. So I want to thank you, and I'm sure our listeners and viewers will enjoy this and learn a great deal from it. Thank you.
Yeah, and I hope they'll apply those things to tap, meditate, do what it takes to de-stress yourself, direct your attention to the inner life, and everything about your outer life starts to change.